We've talked about politics and comics, but what about social issues? Is that a new thing? Well, not really. Let's take a look. Hey there, this is Perch. Talking about social issues in comics, how do you represent them? It's an interesting topic because some of the newer readers will say things like, "Oh, comics have gotten very political," or "Comics have gotten very social, and they didn't used to be this way." And we've covered that in an earlier show. How political really are comics, and where do politics come in? And they've always been there, but how is it different today? And there's an earlier video on that. You can go check it out. Maybe I'll link to it down in the comments. Probably will forget. But the other part is social issues. So it was very popular in the 70s, and in a lot of cases there was some, government cheese tied to it, so you could say, where they would do anti-smoking issues or anti-drug issues, or they would do, various kind of almost after-school special type comics, where in this very special episode of Spider-Man, Spider-Man meets a junkie and teaches him about the problems of drugs. And you had those, and they were intended to kind of get the message out to a different audience through comics. That was the purpose of them. And even when you didn't have those, you would still have stories that kind of like to tag themselves to, for lack of a better word, social issues of the day. Of how do we get this kind of how do we tie into something that's currently on the minds of a lot of people around the country or of our reader base. And I think, I'll speak very, very high level and generally. I think Marvel tended to be a little bit more, they would take a more realism approach where they would kind of introduce these issues, be a little grittier, a little more real, if you will. DC tended to abstain in a lot of cases from doing this, but they did have some. They had Speedy as a junkie, and they had various other comics, other, storylines like this. But the interesting part is that while Marvel would be more, quote unquote, realistic with it, Marvel's stories were often more one and done. They'd have, a situation crop up where they're wanting to tackle homelessness or they're wanting to tackle, something like that. They'd have even some, heroes be homeless, like D-Man was homeless for a period of time, or just various kind of social ills that go on in the comics, and they'd have this theme kind of get brought up. They did it in some of the X Force, the later issues, long past the Liefeld time, where they'd bring up social issues and they'd kind of tackle them in the comic, and then they would largely forget about it by the next comic. It wouldn't carry over. Whereas DC would take a more high level, almost non-real approach to it. But then it seemed like DC would really struggle to figure out how to tie that into continuity. Like if they made a character a drug addict, they would you know feel like, okay, well, we gotta remember this drug addiction problem 20 years from now in a comic. There was a little bit. DC seemed to want to hold on to those things once they introduced them, but they'd introduced them in a soft way, whereas Marvel would introduce it in a harder way and then fairly quickly forget that it ever happened. And it's kind of an interesting kind of difference of styles. But social issues and kind of these kinds of things are not new to comics. I feel like, like a lot of entertainment does, or did, I should say, is handling of gay, or now more the LGBTQ, but before even all of the different letters, just kind of gay, lesbian topics. They were handled in a really kind of ham-fisted. I always felt like the comic writers did not really know how to bring these things into the story. North Star coming out was one of the wackiest. I mean, I don't know. It's just very funny in hindsight to see this big splash page of North Star going, "I am gay." And it was not handled well. It was handled in a very 90s way, let's say. But that was true of a lot of things. TV shows and other parts of entertainment were handled it as delicately. It was just very not the cleanest, let's say, way of doing things. So I think that, so again, to the original topic, social issues have been going on in comics for a long time. This isn't new. They've addressed lifestyle, they've addressed drugs, they've addressed homelessness, they've addressed various social ills, and for different reasons. They've done it for kind of government grant type reasons. They've done it for, that they believe in the cause. They've put ribbons on the comics at various times for the AIDS epidemic or for veteran causes. So there's different social ways that comics have, for a long time have played into this. Certainly since the 70s. The crazy part is, and that just from my perspective, other people I'm sure will disagree, but from my perspective, it feels like the social issues have been handled more poorly, let's say, as the years have gone on. So if you go to and maybe this is just kind of when you start reading it and kind of how you absorb the information. Maybe it's just me that's changing over the years. I acknowledge that. But in the 70s and the 80s, there was more of an attempt to actually kind of get a little bit deeper than just the shallow end of the social issue. And then in the 90s and kind of aughts, it became more, I'd say more shallow, more just like, hey, let's just dump the topic out into the pages of the comic, but not really go into any depth. Let's just do it to kind of get it out there. And then now in the last decade, it feels like the social issues are tackled almost more for it feels more like they're copying somebody else's handling of social issues. So it's like Unstoppable Wasp had a lesbian couple, and complete with like, how am I going to tell my parents, and they're not going to approve, and but I love this woman, and all my friends are really happy and supportive, and it felt like this storyline was lifted completely off of a Netflix show or Will and Grace, or just it didn't feel original. It felt like a carbon copy of how a social issue was handled somewhere else. So it didn't ring true. It didn't. I mean, it's fine. I mean, they're comic characters and they're supporting characters, so it really doesn't matter. But the way the jokes and the humor played out, it felt a lot more like something you'd seen before, a watered down copy of something you'd seen before. It didn't feel, necessarily connected. And I think that's true even with things like Iceman and the recent series, the two series they've done of Iceman coming out to his parents, and this very kind of by the numbers stereotypical reaction of how the parents would absorb the fact that Bobby is gay, and kind of how all that stuff would play out. It's just it's interesting if you go through comics and you pick out a couple of issues. So I'm really thinking here of, take a look at kind of some of the earlier Spider-Man and Daredevil issues where we were dealing with drug abuse and then some lifestyle changes, bullying, kind of how those topics were handled. Even as silly as it sounds, even the Fantastic Four issue where a paparazzi takes a picture of She-Hulk and sunbathing naked, and then she goes out and tries to stop this. Or kind of right in that same era, a little boy who wanted to be like the Human Torch, pouring gasoline on himself and kind of lighting him on fire, and kind of how the Human Torch absorbed that moment. There were very thoughtful stories done about topics that are more social issues around kind of how we fit in as people. And so take a couple comics from that era, and then a couple comics from the 90s and aughts era, where like the North Star coming out issue, and some of the ones like that, where it's you'll see a different style. And then today, kind of how, like I mentioned, the Unstoppable Wasp handles it and everything else. And I think you'll find, I mean, again, you'll find from my perspective that the quality of how these issues are being handled and being presented to the readers is a huge kind of shifting target. And so it's just interesting to watch how these things come out. And I think this isn't one that you beat up on comics too much for, because, okay, you watch TV, you watch movies, and you'll see a similar style there as well. Art imitates art. So you'll see very similar themes kind of rolling out for each one. But I guess the conclusion is, social issues, no, they're not new. They've been in comics for a long time. The difference is how they've been handled, and they've been handled very differently from era to era. And we're still, I think in terms of tracking what's going to happen next, we're in, I think, the tail end of an era with comics. there's this cycle. I think Mark Miller described it as a 20-year cycle. I think it's shorter than that. I think it's about a 12, 15-year cycle where you have certain themes and certain styles and certain, how comics get made being, following suit within this era. And I think we're about 2 years away from a flip from the next era coming in, kind of 2021. I think you'll see some different things. I think a lot of things are going to happen in the next 2 years as well around distribution and kind of how comics are getting made and how they're getting paid for and kind of all those things. So it's an interesting time. I think I'm anxious to see how it's handled more. I do miss kind of the way a lot of these social themes were done in the 70s and 80s because even though the Comics Code Authority made some of them very very ham-fisted as well, they weren't subtle about smoking bad, but the way that kind of more intangible topics like what do you do with bullying or those kinds of things, how that was handled in comics is a little bit more. There's more depth to it, and I think that today's social issues, given where we are as a society and how there's a lot of confusion, a lot of people trying to figure things out, I think we would benefit a lot from depth. And so I would love to see some things. I would love to see some stories take more care. I'm actually saying almost the exact opposite of what a lot of complainers and other people say about comics. Au contraire, I don't want the elimination of LGBTQ storylines in comics. Not at all. I would like to see them handled with more care and attention. I'd actually like to see some thoughtfulness put into those, and I'd like to see other topics like how do you handle political differences? How do you handle religious characters or non-religious people kind of interacting together and these difference of ideologies? I'd like to see more care put into those topics, and I think that the topics deserve care and deserve some real looking at. So, I mean, far from wanting them nixed completely, I'd rather see them actually treated like important topics and not as kind of little like zingers that are going to go into the page. Anyway, what do you think? How do you see social issues evolving and how they're represented in comics and what's been your reaction to a lot of this stuff? Leave a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notification. Tell a friend. You can follow me on Comic Perch on Twitter. And thanks for listening.